8 Ball Deluxe was a popular pinball machine produced by Bally in 1981. It was themed on pool playing, or perhaps pool hustling, and the game was well designed and captured the public imagination. In fact, this machine was so popular that it was re-released a few years later. Again, while pinballs may have been popular with some players, they weren't a huge feature of the British amusement arcade by the late 1980s, due to the ways that they were taxed and regulated. Despite this, 8 Ball Deluxe, Gorgar and Black Knight were pinball machines that the Kane family brought and operated in their Herne Bay arcades. David Kane clearly had a passion for pinball, even if they were less profitable than other machines that might be cited in the same space. Black Knight was another pinball machine that could be found in the Herne Bay arcades. It was made by Williams in 1980 and was popular in the arcades. While the game wasn't in any arcade that I played in often, and I don't recall ever playing it, Black Knight included a feature that removed some of the gripes that I had with pinball machines. It included something called MagnaSave, where the player could employ a magnet to avoid some of the most frustrating situations, where you can see that your ball is rolling towards the drains on the edge of the board. The magnets would give you the chance of preventing that ball's loss and help you continue playing. While you didn't see that many pinball machines in arcades because of their constant need for maintenance and the way they were taxed, popular and well thought out pinball machines often remained available in arcades. In the arcades that I hung around in, there were always a few pinball machines, all through the years that I was there. I just never really played them. If you were a visitor to British arcades during the 1980s, you'd have seen the gradual arrival of automated change machines such as the Thomas 3000 series. While not something that most arcade fans might think about, the fact is that these machines became an important part of the arcade experience. The very specific sound of the clatter of coins in the change tray, and then later the whirring noise as a £5 or £10 note was ingested into the machine, are etched in my memory. These machines are incredibly sturdy, tamper-proof and really heavy, and received regular updates to keep up with changes in currency, such as when new coins were introduced, or where inflation made prices higher, or new payment technologies were introduced. If you visit a British amusement arcade right now, the chances are that you'll find a Thomas change machine still working after decades of use. Crompton's Double Falls is one of the best loved and most often seen penny pushers found in a typical British arcade. It was released in 1974 by the Ramsgate-based company Crompton's, and much like each of their successive machines, was more complex and fascinating to play. In Double Falls, as the name suggests, coins don't just land and build up on one platform, but two. Penny pushers, like these, were hugely popular, especially so with elderly and very young players. But even though they might seem sedate, don't be fooled. Penny pushers like Double Falls, Clean Sweep and Silver Skis were the income backbone of the British arcade. They're seen by arcade owners as reliable and consistent earners, and Crompton's built a reputation as makers of the very best of these types of machines. There's not a lot that I can say about fruit machines, other than stressing the fact that they were part of the very pleasure of playing in the arcade. I'd enter the arcade knowing how much money I had, and therefore how many times I could play on my favourite games, but as the arcade visit would go on, I'd be thinking of ways to extend the fun. One of the things that we'd always do, unless being watched by the arcade manager, was to check the coin reject slot, as it was quite common to find money in them. Other times you might hear a clatter of coins falling into a penny pusher hopper when it wasn't being played. This was just a product of gravity and the coins very slowly tipping over the side. And then the other thing that you'd do would be play on fruit machines. We'd keep an eye on who else had been playing the machines and made a mental note of which machines had been played and which had recently paid out jackpots. In fact, this arcade intelligence was often shared by friends when they entered the arcade. You'd meet a friend who'd say to you that one machine was due a payout or that another should be avoided because someone had just taken a jackpot. We also developed carefully guarded strategies for playing the different fruit machines, and whether or not they made any difference, players would often cover certain parts of a fruit machine with a hand to better concentrate on a timing sequence or special feature. Fruit machines, for me and my friends, were not really a problem. They didn't suck up all of our money and we weren't addicted to them. Instead, we just used them as another way of potentially extending our money and our play, and one where we became very much aware of the risks and potential rewards. Sometimes it was just better to go and spend your last money on your favourite game, or on the Parrot, or on Zane Slina, but other times the fruit machine was the way forward. Pinball machines weren't all that popular in British amusement arcades by the late 80s, at least not compared to other countries. This was partly because of the ways that pinball machines were taxed and regulated by the British government, where they were treated in the same way as fruit machines or other low-stakes gambling. Another reason was simply that they needed constant maintenance, light bulbs needed replacing, mechanical parts needed fixing, and bumpers and springs broke and snapped. Compared to video games that weren't taxed as aggressively and that either worked or were utterly broken, pinball ended up a choice for arcade owners who either loved them or who saw the need for variation in their machine mix. Even so, Gorgar, made by Williams in 1979, was an exceptional pinball machine and was famous for being the first machine to include speech synthesis of 7 words. These words were combined to communicate and talk with the player. Gorgar was a popular machine and was featured in the Herne Bay arcades. I'll have to admit this, pinball was never for me. I just couldn't understand what was fun about it. But even back in the 1990s, I remember fans who felt the same way about video games. Can you believe it? Irrespective of what your pleasure is, the best amusement arcades offered you something to play, whether it was pinball or video games or penny pushers or fruit machines. Black Tiger was a hack-and-slash platforming game made by Capcom in 1987. I can't say much about it, as it wasn't really a particularly important, pioneering or especially good game. But it was one game that I sometimes played in my local arcade long after it was new. I found the game was quite unfair at times, especially the difficulty of the climbing sections and the green snake monsters that would inevitably appear, spit fire and kill my character. Perhaps the arcade owner was especially fond of the game, or other people played it, or they just had no other new spare game boards to put into the machines. I don't know. But for whatever reason, the game hung around in my arcade for years after its release, well into the mid to late 1990s. And I guess this was one of the pleasures of the British arcade. You never quite knew what you'd find in them, and you'd quite often find brand new releases and games from years ago in the same space. Saint Dragon, made by Jaleco in 1989, wasn't an especially important video game. Don't get me wrong, it was a visually impressive and fun shoot-'em-up where you control a metal fire-spitting dragon head along with a long trailing neck or tail that acts as a shield. The head shoots but is weak, and the tail or the neck is used to protect the head. Saint Dragon is interesting though in this arcade in Herne Bay, as it was cited here as a prototype, and information was collected about its popularity and coin drop income to then be reported back to the distributor and used to decide how many they might import into the country, how much they might sell it for, and how successful it might fare in England. Major distributors such as Associated Leisure, Brent Leisure or Electrocoin would work with reliable arcade owners in different types of location, so a busy city arcade perhaps, a major seaside resort, a quiet seaside resort, in order to get a sense of the suitability of their products. This also meant that for people that really cared about arcade games, such as me as a younger teenager, it was always worth visiting nearby arcades in the hope of experiencing an unreleased or prototype game, or something that you might be able to play for a week or two and then never see ever again. I played some right weird games in my time in the arcades. Saint Dragon wasn't a weird one. It did well and was released in many arcades and then converted to home consoles and computers. Final Blow was a boxing arcade video game produced by Japanese developer Taito and distributed in the UK by Electrocoin. It wasn't an especially good game, but its design with large sprites of the boxers on the screen, its opportunity for two-player competitive play, and some really excellent sound design and audio samples make it a striking machine. The whooshing noise of the punch swings and the bassy thud when they connected permeated the arcade, alongside the referee's countdown and the bell rings at the end of a round. Final Blow was also interesting, as it was one of the video games that attracted a different crowd, and on a couple of occasions I saw holiday-making dads playing the game, seemingly having had a pint or two in the pub on a summer's day. Of course, these players would not be especially good at the game, but they would be loud and enthusiastic, evidently boxing fans. I imagine that while their family were playing other games somewhere else in the arcade, Final Blow was familiar enough to be worth a credit or two, especially in an arcade that lacked a proper punch bag. Final Blow was also interesting because of the way that it offered a sense of what was yet to come. It worked a bit like Street Fighter 2, released a few years later, but it wasn't anywhere near as much fun to play.